Right, so I actually got asked to just finish off with the last little presentation here. So as the chairman, I've got to keep myself on time. And I've also somehow got to think of a good question to ask myself when you guys are very quiet at the end. So it'll be quick. What I got asked to do was really just try and roll up some of these things we've been talking about really at the end of the day, how do you choose a variety? As it says there, selecting horses for courses. For me, with chickpea, I reckon that's pretty simple. It narrows down very quickly. It's not as complex as some of the cereal choices. You look at those cereal charts, you've got 100 varieties there. But so I'm just going to briefly go through a few thought processes of mine to see how we might answer that question about selecting a chickpea variety. And I guess also as hopefully the breeding program continues to do more work, good work, our choices will tend to broaden out a little bit. So when you're selecting that variety, what do we consider? Well, for me, the first thing is yield. We get paid dollars per tonne. So the first thing is what's going to give me the greatest yield in my environment. So there's a few environmental farming system type questions to go with that, but that's the one at the end of the day we're all chasing the tonnes per hectare. But then what comes into that for me over the top is minimising our production risk. So just because it's the highest yielder, if it's also the highest risk because of botrytis grey mould or phytophthora or viruses or something else, then is it worth chasing that yield? Are we better off settling for a slightly lower yield but having less production risk and more consistent return? For me also, because I look at the whole market chain, value chain, marketability of that variety. We tend to focus obviously on Desi chickpea in this part of the world, and that left-hand image being PBA hat trick. That's pretty standard Australian Desi chickpea. It's fairly angular, it's what the Indians like, it's what the Pakistanis like, it's what we all deliver to GrainCorp or otherwise. But some of you would also be aware of or even grow or have clients who grow Kyabra. Again, it's Australian Desi chickpea. But if you look carefully, it does have some different characteristics to the hat trick. It's plumper, it's nowhere near as angular, and it actually goes into a different market predominantly. It can be commingled with hat trick and go into India, or if you're close enough to the right points, it can go out in the container trade directly to Bangladesh where they particularly like that one. So we've got some sort of marketing choices as well about our varieties. And then to really push the envelope on the right-hand side here, the Kabuli, totally different type of thing, totally different market. The market dynamics are separated. So yeah, we can now talk about marketing risk as well as production risk. So trying to line those three things up goes into that, making that variety selection. We talk about area of adaptation or regional adaptations. Now PBA, so that's Pulse Breeding Australia, they tend to work with these broad areas. So Central Queensland being a unique environment in its own breeding node up there, looking for material that is adapted to that environment. Short season, high temperatures towards the end. We've got this really big liquor country in the middle, being northern New South Wales, southern Queensland. At the moment, we don't have varieties, and the breeding program probably isn't really targeting specific varieties for specific parts of that region. Now, hat trick will grow up anywhere in those areas. Same with boundary. Whereas as we head into the more temperate southern zones, yeah, now the varieties are significantly different. They're a lot more prostrate. They're longer seasoned. They don't fit in our environment. So we do talk about regional adaptation within the breeding program, within all pulses. But the reality is they're fairly large regions. We don't have early, mid and long season varieties. It all tends to compact down pretty quickly. I'll just throw this one in because no matter what we do with varieties, if that soil or the environment isn't right, we're not going to be able to overcome that with variety. So hopefully you'll be fairly familiar with chickpea, which it's that rotation of 1 in 4 years. The big thing that I often see is either the waterlogging component. Broadleafs don't like wet feet, and you heard Kevin speak about Phytophthora, which is a disease of wet feet. And the other one is sodicity and chloride. They tend to also cap us quite a bit. So let's at least make sure the environment we're starting with is right for the species that we're trying to grow, and then think about varieties. NVT, So hopefully you all are familiar with the website for NVT and utilise it. What I've just pulled out there is for Billa, so pretty close to here. The last 7 years averages. And yeah, there's not a huge amount of difference. Even some of the older varieties, things like How's That, Amber, not a big difference there in yield potential. And you remember my first point is I'm chasing tonnes because I get paid tonnes per hectare. You get paid tonnes per hectare. So how do we tease some of these out? Do I plant hat-trick, or do I plant boundary, or do I plant Kyabra? So that's when I'm then going to overlay that production risk that I mentioned. I know you can't see that one. It turns me cross-eyed just looking at it, but it's another way of looking at yield data. This first one is an average over 7 years in one location for that variety. So you start talking about consistency of that yield. But how many of them were dry, how many of them were wet? Does one variety perform better in dry or wet years? You can't gain that out of a graph like that. The PBA material that's produced with the variety management packages tend to have tables like this, where we're simply looking at the industry standard and how it yielded in the two different regions in that year. Then everything's related as a percentage to that standard. So you run your eye across the boundary and yeah, it's 5-6% better than hat-trick being the standard. But if you think back or look at your weather records, you can now start saying, well, yeah, 2007 was particularly dry, or 2010 you might remember was particularly wet. So you might be able to start teasing out how they perform in some of those different environments. Or you might just go cross-eyed looking at all the numbers. Okay, we don't have a huge depth of difference in yield potential with some of our varieties. What can our varieties do for us about minimising production risk? Well, the reality at the moment, as you've heard, is basically around disease management. So what's its Ascochyta resistance like? What's its Phytophthora resistance like? Again, another table, which we won't go charging through too much. But if you just look at focusing on something like hat-trick and boundary, from an Ascochyta point of view, it's a good story. Both have good levels of resistance. There is a difference there between boundary and hat-trick, with boundary having a greater level of resistance. So in 2010, which was a much higher disease pressure year, only 4% yield loss versus 34% to hat-trick. So that's great. That's our dominant disease. That's the one that I want the protection to. I'll go and grow boundary. But you've just seen what Kevin's done, and these numbers try and support that, but his graphs were a lot better than my numbers, about the susceptibility of boundary to Phytophthora root rot. So what's your risk to that pathogen starts to dictate which variety you may or may not look at. So again, getting back to that production risk. So really, at the moment, you're teasing out, do we grow Kyabra, do we grow hat-trick, do we grow boundary, do we stick with the really old ones? I think most of us are hopefully fairly comfortable with where those varieties sit. What's coming in the future, and I'm hoping you can remember where 912 sat in some of Kevin's graphs a minute ago. So it's the next most likely release out of the breeding program. If you got to any of the field days last spring, you would have heard people talking about 912. Have a really good look at it this spring when the time comes. And for me, what it's doing at the moment is packaging the best traits of what we've currently got. So I've really just sort of summarised there the yield potential. It's going to be around about boundary. Might be a couple of % better. So we're just steadily gaining yield potential. The Ascochyta resistance is about as good as boundary, which is the best we've currently got. And I'll have to review that now after Kevin's graph. I've said there that the Phytophthora is about equivalent to hat-trick. Those couple of graphs that Kevin was showing was it's much closer to Yorker, which is a real positive because it's the best material we've got at the moment. So as things settle down with a bit more data, we'll come up with where those sit. But it's starting to package the best of what we've currently got. Where's the breeding program going in the future though? Well as focusing on those things, trying to also obviously look at some of the other limitations to our production and to our farming systems. So root lesion nematode, resistance tolerance, that needs to start coming into the equation. Chickpeas aren't too bad, but they do build our Proteolyncus numbers. So now we're starting to talk about rotation implications. Virus resistance, we heard Murray talk about that, a big challenge there, but it is being looked at. The BGM was mentioned before, the botrytis. Yeah, look, it's on the wish list, but it's really hard to work with. So who knows, and particularly as we don't get an infection that often. And salt tolerance is another one. Think about the amount of country where we'd be being limited with that salt tolerance or lack of with chickpeas. And there's probably some exciting stuff coming along there in the next 3, 5+ years. So, the breeding program, I think, is doing a reasonable job. Just going back to that, making that selection of variety, I also put a lot of value in local experience. So this photo is actually from out Jalaka way. You go out that way and lots of growers tell me, Gordo, we stick with Kyabra. It out-yields your hat trick, it out-yields your boundary. Yeah, we know it's susceptible to ascochyta, but it's a dry environment out there and we can manage it, we know what we're doing. All the trial data would suggest that Kyabra shouldn't be out-yielding, particularly boundary. Boundary should be ahead of it. So what's going on? It's a bit darker in here now, so hopefully we can maybe see it a little bit in these photos. This one on the right is actually Kyabra. The one on the left is boundary. And there are these areas in here, patches up here, which are starting to desiccate, starting to go off. This was first week of September last year. And we can't see the same in the Kyabra. There's a couple up here which I can see. And when we actually got down and had a damn good look, what it turned out to be, I believe, was salt. So, sorry, mate? No, it wasn't melon holes. It was not melon hole country. But the actual effects, when you got down and had a good look, and when we actually then went and looked at soil tests, very high salt levels at about 30 to 40 centimetres. So we're running out of moisture here. That's why these areas are starting to senesce. The Kyabra was starting to, but nowhere near as badly. So out there, I see a varietal difference that's not supported by the trial work. We're not screening for that with the trial work. But grower experience year after year says Kyabra outperforms. So don't disregard the value of those on-farm trials, or in this case, it's half paddock trials, as to what works in those, making those decisions about varieties. But you've got to start somewhere, starting with that data out of the breeding program, starting with yields, starting with particularly disease management. So I think that's all I had on variety selection, because for me it narrows down pretty jolly quickly. A couple of you in the audience are from CQ, different varieties, but we're asking virtually the same questions. And it starts narrowing down as to what's available.